This is mostly going to be a working session, but I wanted to give a little bit of background about why we're holding this session a little bit. Oh, yes, I'm Ruth Dewar, Ronan Institute ex-NSIDC person. So, whoa, what is wrong? Oh.
I don't think you're actually in presentation yet.
Yes, that's true.
Oh, it's in preview.
Why is it in preview? Why is it? Okay, now that's.
Is Keynote not on there?
I don't know. But that looks like it might work.
Your animation may not work. We'll try.
Okay, fine. Anyways, so we're talking this, the whole concept of a data mentor or data advocate or whatever is something that came up because, oh, look at that.
Let's see if Keynote is actually on there.
That is not displaying at all nicely. Yeah, well, so where to go now?
It should be in your downloads.
Yes.
That's it.
Open with, oh, there's no Keynote.
Go to
Okay.
yeah. No, it's starting in preview. Hey. Can we swap?
I don't want to spend that much time on this. Okay, I'll just, you'll just have to get them off the fig share.
Yeah, it's just, we'll roll with it.
Right, and I will put it back into slideshow mode, even though you're not going to be able to see like half the screen. Sorry, that's just the way it goes. This one looks fine.
Yeah, I don't know why the next one is
not showing at all. Interesting.
Let's try again.
That's not working.
There we go. I don't.
That makes no sense.
Yes.
But in any case, the point is that we've had a lot of interesting things happen the last few years. And in my opinion, there is vital earth science data that should really always be available and accessible, no matter what nonsense is going on around the world. I have a longer speech on that topic, all about, you know, how the World Data Center systems got set up and were cloned across 3 continents, but I'm not going to go into that now because that was the past and it no longer works. Oh, look at that. That's even weirder. Yeah, this is ridiculous. Okay. Okay, close enough. It's not, whatever. Anyways, so several years ago, I was teaching the foundations of data curation at the Graduate School of Library and Information Science before they changed their name at UIUC. And I made all of my students actually curate a data set, because one of the problems that I've seen is that until you actually have touched and played with data, you don't know DITs. I mean, you may think you know something, but you don't. And then we had this election, and there was a lot of data angst in the public at that point. And a lot of ad hoc data rescue efforts spun up, many of them not really informed by people who really work with data. And which caused ESIP to actually write a white paper called Stronger Together, which basically said that data rescue is absolutely a needed thing, but you really need to work with the communities who really know what really needs rescuing and what needs to be done. But that paper just said, hi, here's a nice big problem, and it didn't suggest any solutions. But I happen to know of a few things like the Boulder Data Rescue Program, which was considerably different than a lot of the other data rescue programs because it was run by a person who actually dealt with data as part of her day job. And they actually were after not just web pages, but they were actually after all the files and metadata and the schema and this, that, and the other thing. And so I hooked her up with Boulder Data Rescue, which is probably why I got invited to a workshop that they held from an IMLS grant that many of us here went to, where they were trying to come up with what the definition of a data rescue toolkit should be. And at that meeting, somebody said, well, what we need is a match.com for data people who have needs and people who have skills. And so that's how this all got started. And so there's this thing now that amazingly enough, a Boulder company has so far funded the development for called data@risk.org. That company deals with data and was worried about all of this, and their chief data officer is kind of concerned and is keeping a private archive of a few petabytes of government data. She would love to make it, publicly accessible, but the cloud provider she was using to do that part decided that it was becoming too popular and they weren't going to provide it to her for free anymore, but the data is still there and still growing. And she's totally into, maybe the government shouldn't be the only place that has copies of all of this stuff. So a group of us basically came up with this data@risk.org, whole point of which is to connect people who have data needs to people who have data rescue expertise. And we have spent, this happened last September, and we spent the time since then, thinking about roles and responsibilities. And we had this issue that I had a nice, pretty little animation here that you're not going to see, that, we first called them data minions, people who knew what they were doing and could, help say, this guy's, has this data that needs to be rescued. He needs somebody who knows OCR. He needs somebody who knows metadata. He needs somebody who does XYZ and could parse that thing into something that was doable tasks that you could then match against skills of a volunteer community. I note that the Boulder Data Rescue community itself has 140 members. So that's just one town. But a lot of people didn't like the word minion because a lot of people, basically think, well, that's demeaning. So we thought, well, how about mentor? Well, there were other people who didn't like the word mentor because you weren't really mentoring people. You were just kind of making sure that the right kinds of people got connected. And so now we have the word data advocate, which is not what was in our actual abstract for this article. Yes. And I'm not sure that that'll stick either. You guys might help determine that. But in any case, so the roles are, we have a data submitter who has some data they think needs work. And we have data heroes, which are, that was an easy one to figure out. If you're going to help somebody with their data and you're doing it on a volunteer basis, you're obviously a hero. And then we have this other category, the people who work behind the scenes to facilitate this whole thing going on. And we came up with a process, where you could submit a request The advocate approves and kind of sorts those requests and figures out, well, what kind of skills are needed. And then heroes search, select, and work on those things. The advocate looks at the results and goes, I'm sorry, that does not look like SPA's metadata to me. And it goes back to them and they have to work on it some more. And at some point, the advocate comes in and says, yeah, I think it's ready to be sent off to whoever submitted it. And they would approve that. And then all of a sudden, that data becomes probably more accessible or at least preserved or something. And that's pretty much my presentation. And at this point, I will turn it over.
All right, so now it is actually time for us to work a little bit, because Ruth explained this really well. You know, data@risk.org is meant to be kind of a matching service between people who have data needs to people who have data expertise. But the person making those connections, what we're currently called a data advocate, you know, it's like the submitter, we don't need to define their role because that's fairly obvious, I would think. The data hero, we also have a really good concept of what that role actually encompasses. But the data advocate, and if somebody comes up with a better name, we may roll with it. But that particular role, what sorts of skills do they need? How do we really kind of define the bounds of that role? And by the way, I want you to know you can be all three roles at various points, that you are not limited to a particular role through data@risk.org. You can have data that needs help, you can be a data hero, and you can be that connector. But the goal of the session was to really get some feedback from people who might use a site like this to make those connections, whether as a volunteer helping with the process or as a person who is submitting data. What we're going to do is, I think Ruth has kind of an idea what she thinks a data advocate should be. I have that sort of idea as well. And we've tried to frame it, but we'll give our kind of more specific definition in just a minute. But we want feedback from the people in this room. If there's anybody online, we're going to need to use the handheld mic so they can hear, because otherwise they will not be able to hear. We don't have any more slides. We're using paper and pen because I have found that actually really does facilitate discussion. If you need a reference back to kind of the process and all of that, we do have a poster up on the wall of both the roles, kind of the very broad definition of the role, as well as the envisioned process. You can also go to data@risk.org and see that as well, if you're online and can't see the poster. Ruth kind of covered how I envision that data advocate role. They are advocating, and I can't remember who came up with the term advocate, but I personally like that term because they are advocating for appropriate data management and data conservation. That they are matching up particular skills with particular needs. They're advocating for what's best for the data. So that is a good term for this person because they are being the advocate for the data. Ruth, did you want to kind of build on that, contradict me?
I'm not going to contradict her, but I'll add that obviously those advocates need to have certain skills. And if this sounds like, what skills should a data manager have, that may be accurate. So you might want to think about, if you had something. Well, let me give some concrete examples. The NASA Space Science Data Center sent me a list of 600 data sets from some of NASA's very earliest rockets and satellites that they ever launched. And the reason why they did that is because they have the bits and they have Xerox's PDF files, image files of the original mimeographed documentation. But these spacecraft, that's pre-ASCII, it's pre-EBCDIC, it's pre-BCD, it's all bit stuff. And so nobody's using it because modern people apparently don't know how to fiddle bits, or that's too much work. They would like that data to be converted into SPACE metadata and CDF files because that's what that community uses. And I actually had a couple students do a couple of them, and those were successful, and actually those students got credited in a poster at AGU. So we know that this can work, but obviously they were students, and they did need some mentorship. But on the other hand, the people in Boulder have started going down that path and rescuing some of those data sets themselves. And so far that looks pretty good. But I guess the real issue is what skills do we need to look for people willing to play that intermediary role? I mean, obviously I think I was able to do that successfully at least a few times. And I happen to know that most archive managers have similar piles of stuff, maybe analog, maybe digital, that, are not in a format that is amenable to modern data use in any kind of reasonable way. I'll use the NSIDC Glacier Photo Collection as an example of that because it was not used really at all before it got digitized and put online, and then it became one of the NSIDC's most popular products. So, back to you. So, yeah, okay, right there. I gotta sit down.
Hello? It's on. Okay. I think so. I guess I'd like to just get a little more clarification or background clarification on what this is all about before we get into that. So Ruth, earlier you mentioned quote unquote nonsense together with 2016. So is the assumption that the problem that's driving this is political, governmental? If so, I have let me complete this thought. So if that's the case, then is where these things will be going to will be on the private side, and is that assumed to be safe?
No, actually, totally not that. That was that sort of was the motivation for volunteers to get interested in this at all. But as I said, the Stronger Together white paper was written basically by the ESIP data stewardship folks from NOAA, NASA, USGS, et cetera, basically saying there's a lot of data help we need because, let's face it, none of those agencies have the funds to do the work they really need to do. But you should talk to us and not try and go off and do it, surreptitiously. And they had a bunch of recommendations in there for about if you're going to do this, what should you do, but they didn't have any mechanisms to do that, to connect people who are willing to help out with these problems to the agencies, basically. And when I say agencies, I mean that broadly, because it doesn't have to be a federal agency. It could be a state agency or a local agency, or it could be a researcher who has a terabyte of data that they have no home for, and people are using it at a $40 an hour rate. which is something that happened to me. And so I ended up deleting the data out of Amazon because I couldn't afford it. So it's an attempt to play a matchmaker service between groups that have needs and this large community who's willing to, probably on a 1 or 2 hour basis, help out.
Let me tell you one thing that data@risk.org is not. It is not a repository. It is not a home for wayward data. We have talked about whether or not it might be feasible for it to be a temporary foster home, but at this point, we do not have the bandwidth, both, personal time nor actual bandwidth to do that sort of work. So it is not a place to house your data, but it is a place to find someone to help you connect to a place to house your data. Does that help answer? I think he's going to follow up and then we'll go to you.
Yeah.
And actually, please introduce yourself when many of us know each other, but for those who don't, it's always good, particularly if we do have someone online, it's always good to identify yourself.
Okay. Bill 10, NASA Goddard. So the white paper you have on the wall, right? Those are getting towards, I guess, solutions, right? Or means to matchmaker.
So right now, there are 3 kind of categories of people who are interacting or who will be interacting with this data@risk.org. We have people who are submitting, who need the help, the submitters. We have the people who are doing the data conservancy work, or the actual, metadata work or whatever needs to be done to those data sets. And then there's this intermediary role that we are currently calling data advocate. And we are trying to better define that, what sort of, what skills they may need and what actually they're going to be, what exactly they will be doing.
Okay. So sorry, I'm still.
So that's why the data advocate skills. Right. So what sort of skills, if you have your ideal person in this role, what sorts of skills would you want them to have, as well as if you have the ideal situation or role, what does that role encompass? So they're like separate but related. And if we don't like how I have that set up, I am not going to be offended if we kind of throw that out. By the way, I am Denise Hills, for those of you who don't know me. And I work for the Geologic Survey of Alabama, which is a state government agency, so slightly different roles.
Sorry, I'm still behind. I'm not there yet. Okay? I'm still trying to understand the scope of the problem here. So at our the NASA Goddard DAC, right? So we have done data rescue. So I'm still trying to understand when you say, do you have data submitters and, matching, what's the scope of the problem here? So when we have a problem like that, is that part of the problem or are we outside of that?
Okay, so it depends on whether you have data that you don't think is accessible because it's in an outdated format and it doesn't have reasonable metadata and those sorts of things. I would say, in my opinion, that is probably totally biased by my history, that NASA, and particularly NASA Earth Science, is probably one of the better places for managing their data. I know that NASA Space Science Data Center has problems with that because they have 600 data sets that are, basically not useful at this point. They have metadata in the sense of, we know the name of it, we know the mission, we know sort of the years, but beyond that, you have to read these images of PDF files and here's some bits. And you have to figure out how to decode those bits, which is not something that your average scientist is going to use, right? So I personally think the scope of the problem in the United States is immense, because we also know from discussions with NOAA that they have an entire basement full of weather data that is just sitting there slowly moldering and that they could use some help with that. And this might be the kind of thing that they could do. It's kind of like the old weather, ship log stuff. It's kind of like Zooniverse, if anybody's familiar with that. But I keep thinking of it as Match.com. People can put things on the list of here's the stuff I need, and we figured out what that means in terms of skill sets, and then we can match them to the group of volunteers we have who are willing to help out.
I'll do a quick follow-up while you're passing the mic. So I think in your case, NASA is not necessarily the target user, but smaller agencies like mine might be, because we don't have a data manager, and so we might be a more likely user than the kinds of folks that you work with. All right.
And of course, the file cabinets of research data, as faculty retire and they have a file cabinet of data. And with that transition, I'm Daniel Fuca from Virginia Tech. And I'm gonna give a first volunteer of something to put onto a sheet. And that would be the skills. Under the skills site, I would actually just throw up shell scripting. The one thing that I would add to this is these are not skills that they necessarily need to have, but as we list skills, think of how we could also put a training module on it, so that if a data advocate were to be interested in being a data advocate, the lack of shell scripting should not get in the way of them wanting to come in. They could they would be able to take we would be able to forward them towards a 30-minute or 1 hour shell scripting tutorial that would then give them that qualification. So we don't want that to be a minimal.
And I think we're not necessarily expecting, we might say, okay, you have to have these skills, but these are kind of desired or ones that you can kind of say yes, because all our heroes are not going to have the same skill sets either. So that sort of thing.
And one addition is, given that there's 140 people in Boulder, I'm wondering if there's a possible solution just within the old BitTorrent realm, which would be a new BitTorrent realm, but BitTorrent in which everyone could actually share a folder, and between the 140 people, you would have many terabytes of data.
We're not really trying to solve the where is the data finally going. We may come up with solutions for, temporary fostering while you're fiddling with bits or whatever. And no, we haven't looked at any particular technologies. I think there are a lot of technologies. I mean, we've seen IPFS kind of take off, which is the Interplanetary File System, which is a non-IP based peer-to-peer network. And, that is a reasonable possibility. And I know those people, but no, we haven't really, we're really more concerned with the matchmaking at this point than any other part of the problem. We do have, like I said, a tech company who actually so far has funded step one of our process, and we're going after funding to implement the rest of the steps. But anyway, did I see a hand over there? Were you
So
again?
Okay, so
Okay.
I've got a couple skills that aren't necessarily technology oriented, because what I'm hearing are physical assets that need to become digital. Digital assets need to become modernized digital. So patience, perseverance, detailed oriented. And I think some of the models from the Zoo Universe world could be used. Because the matchmaker, I think of the old chip logs, and we're trying to pull out the climate data from that, and that was a Zoo Universe project. So we've got a model. It's like mining what they do for the advocate component. Because the heroes might be just regular people too.
So, maybe you can repeat this in one. So technical versus how else would you characterize social? I don't like social.
People skills.
I'm just trying, I want to kind of try and tag them.
Social skills. I mean, if you're going to say,
I like it, I kind of like the soft skills.
I don't think that people will like that.
well, coming from now social science realm, that is a science. You have physical science, and so soft kind of indicates something that's not as useful. So maybe there's another term.
Is it the skill, like you're talking about the skill of being able to talk about data stewardship to a layperson? Is that what you're getting at?
No, I'm getting at when they're trying to have the data submitter who might not really know a whole bunch about data, or maybe does, but it's like, here's this pile, here's all my faculty research, and here's all my stratigraphic records for the 50 years and all these data points, that they're willing to actually kind of go through and figure out what's going on before they move on to the data rescue.
How about communications or people skills? P for people.
That's fine. I just wanted a way to
Character, yeah, because there are different classes of skills.
Would that suggest that possibly Indian might be a good sub?
We can't go back to Indian, I'm sorry, as much as I love it, we can't go back to Indian.
What about Matchmaker? You already wrote that up on the thing.
We got mixed on that one too.
That's true.
I thought it was too,
So this is actually a question about the data hero, but I think it links back to the data advocate. Are you envisioning institutional heroes as well as like people heroes? Because I could imagine if the problem is that you don't have somewhere to put it, it might not be a personal, I can't put it somewhere, but I might have an institution that has the space to store it.
Yes, exactly.
Because then I could see it being like not something that a data advocate needs to know is either how to find or already know what resources are available institutionally, like knowing what Zooniverse is, knowing that it can help with text narrative extraction, helping with that kind of things, I think is just a helpful thing for a data advocate to know. That might be something like just how to use the spreadsheet or how to use the Google that you guys have set up or something.
does that kind of capture? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just need to take a step back for a little bit more clarity, just to make sure that I'm clear on the goals here. But so you've got this data at risk organization who mostly plays matchmaker to get data that's somehow defined as at risk or needs rescue. I don't know how you define that, or how maybe it's an individual who defines that. Yet there is work that is happening to get their data to a point where it needs to be to get to the place that you are recommending it go. Does that make sense?
So
This is where so the reason I'm asking you this is because you talk about a data advocate, the skills and the roles, and I'm wondering, are we talking about that specifically for this sort of entity of a data-at-risk.org,
yes.
or for repository in
No,
general?
no, right now we are trying to define this role within the context of our process here.
Okay. I just
So-
wanted to be clear.
Yes, no, that's fine.
Thank you. Actually, that's exactly the same question I tried to clarify here. So I'm Chongling Xie for Goddard, okay, same thing. Well, because when we're talking about the matchmaker, I think we would have three parties involved, right? Someone try to get the one to date the other one, right? So have to be three. So for this matchmaker, definitely you need to know each other, both of them, because you try to connect them together. But that's one thing first. And secondly, I remember when I attended the winter meeting earlier, when in my mind at the time about data rescue, I'm more concerned about it at the time. Remember, I think I questioned this. This is a little bit political reason at the time. So the Department of Interior tried to kind of probably destroy, retire several science data. So at the time, that I would consider data rescue, for one particular simple example. But again, I would try to ask this same question. Would that still also be one example of the situation here we are going to serve? We are going to try to rescue. So that's my question as well. Right.
I'm not sure I understood the question, but I envision a lot of different scenarios. The researcher with a box of stuff is one real scenario that I've actually personally encountered. Another scenario is we created a database back in the relational database area with all the metadata about these photos, but we lost it over time because that technology rotted and we didn't get to it fast enough. And so now we got to recreate all that metadata. Hi, I'm a university librarian who is the data person for the University of Colorado. And we're taking a copy of the software so that we can start helping our researchers figure out what to do with their data, which is, I think, a totally reasonable thing to do. This is all going to be open source. Anybody could run with it if they wanted to. We're trying to create a toolkit and a site where people can go when they need help. And that can either be local or it could be national, and those will talk to each other so that if somebody does something locally, the national knows. Well, one of the things that I'm not sure that it's absolutely necessary to know the people individually. For example, that's right. You do need to know that. That is a skill. Yeah. Right. The ability to say in this box, there are obviously 3 different kinds of things. They're each a data set. They all need metadata. They're different kinds of things, so it's different metadata. So we need somebody who knows metadata schema A, somebody knows B, and somebody knows C. And these data really ought to be over there. And we know somebody who knows how to take spreadsheets and turn them into CDF or something. Pick your favorite 2 formats. And yes, so what we are talking about is on the data hero side is kind of getting skill sets, associating people with skill sets. I know how to do bit fiddling in Fortran or whatever. One of the people in the Boulder Data Rescue Group is really good at taking OCR documents, taking PDFs, OCRing them and vetting them, and turning them into then text. So that's a bit more archivable, it's now ASCII. So, that may not be a hugely technical skill, but it is a very useful skill. So.
So every day, when it's like a DAC, we receive the user tickets asking for help. And we have a coordinator can read through the email, then can assign to the expert who can answer this question. So probably that's the role we have to play here, like coordinator.
Yeah, no, that's very right. And actually NSIDC kind of had that same role as user services. They kind of try and match make.
But I'm seeing some skills over here that really, I think, belong to the hero, who's the one that participates in the activities of actual rescue.
I know, but they
script. Just a second.
So one of the things you can be an advocate and a hero, but kind of if you, how I'm writing this, it's not necessarily that they have the skills, but they have knowledge of the skills, right? That they understand enough about somebody who knows how to do the OCR data correction that they can go, oh, that's what this problem is, and I can connect them with that person. Now, it may be that they're connecting them with themselves, but so I see your point, but I see it as more that they understand what these needs are rather than necessarily having those skills themselves. Does that?
Yeah, it does seem like the more important aspect than technical is like subject area. Like, not that you need to know how to shell script, but you need to know that shell scripting is something that someone can do. Or not that you need to know how OCR works or how to implement it, but maybe you know that it exists and someone else can do it. And I think along those lines, having some sense of the potential reuse cases lets you know what things need to be done. So if you don't know that people do spatial statistics, you might not realize that it needs to be georeferenced. So having some knowledge of reuse might be helpful. And because it's my own bias, like metadata, like knowing what should be in the metadata and how to find it and how to get it would also be something helpful there. Or knowing how to find someone that knows metadata well enough to say, this is what needs to happen.
I had a question about incentivizing someone to be honestly, I think that data coordinator might actually make a lot more sense as the name. I see that you wrote that up there. But like, how do you plan on incentivizing this? I volunteer a lot with OpenStreetMap, and while it's not the same situation, it's also very similar where you're creating maps on a voluntary basis and takes a lot of time, and they've done a lot of different things to try and get people to participate.
Yeah, we've actually talked about t-shirts and all of those other kinds of, incentives that sometimes can incentivize people. My big concern about this is that the people who really can play that role and play it well, they're in this room maybe, and that might be all of them. And that's the scary part to me, which is why we're spending a fair amount of time on the whole concept of risk. This is something that needs to be done now. Or is it too late already? And is this something that's easy to do? Because there are a lot of people who can, look at handwriting and say that that's a 35, not a 36. And if you have 4 of them and they all come out the same way, you're good. And if you don't have 4 of them, or if all 4 differ, then you're in trouble. So there's easy problems to solve, and then there's ones that are not so easy. And I don't know how the skill sets will vary across the country. I mean, obviously Boulder's a pretty special place, and it even has a high percentage of people who used to work at these agencies who wouldn't mind doing 1 or 2 hours a week of saving their data. At least that's the experience so far. And if it's sexy data, like, I'm sorry, everybody and their brother wants to work in that NASA data. Why? Because it's the earliest satellites and rockets that ever existed. They think it's cool. And so the question is, how can we make some of these other things cool? I think you can make climate data cool. There's a lot of people who care about climate data. I'm a climate reality leader. I had my training with Al Gore. So, I know that community, there's thousands of those people who would probably be willing to spend an hour or 2 a week, doing things to help, make sure that we can push the climate record back a few more dozen years, and that kind of thing. So, there's a whole sales pitch thing.
Thanks. I'm Bob Sandusky, University of Illinois at Chicago. And Ruth, you talked about having some students work on a couple of these data sets, and that made me think about, is there, I'm not sure where this would fit into role or skills, but other stuff, yeah. But there perhaps is an opportunity for folks who are like doing classroom-based data curation, data management education to maybe offer this as part of an educational experience for students. On a particular skill, saying okay, here's we need to learn about how to do OCR and conversions from OCR. So we have these projects, and right now this data set needs the OCR work to be done. And
right. Well, actually, we do have several data librarian type people on our team. And I mean, the only reason why I'm not doing that at Gislis anymore is because I could do it easily with 15 students, but they wanted me to do 70. And I couldn't do that. I just didn't have the capacity to run 70 students through real hands-on experiences with data creation in one semester. I just couldn't. But I do think that there are places where, maybe you could make it a, one of those, independent study things or something, a 3-credit thing, where if you rescue this data set, you're, doing good and you get your degree. So yes, and I know that the library folks that I've been dealing with who are data librarians have been thinking about that kind of stuff. I mean, well, I call this a matchmaking process. It's also the process of trying to bring the library data world and the data world back together. Because in my opinion, they kind of split apart in like the 1950s. And that was probably not a good thing. And I do think that, it'd be really cool if that whole community was able to start stepping into the advocate roles and helping their own local folks. I mean, I think that would be, that was why I was teaching at Gislis.
I think this isn't really a skill, but something that a data advocate would need is time and either support from their job, like their career, whether it's getting like service credit towards their like tenure promotion portfolio, or if it's pro bono work or whatever, or maybe they're retired. Like there needs to be, they have to have time to do this because this is going to take time. And a lot of people that would immediately jump into this role are people that are already very overcommitted.
Could you add credit to that?
Yeah, I'll put that out in just a sec. Because I was going to say, this is actually something I know we have talked a lot about, because if you want to see a really overcommitted person, look at Ruth, and look at me, and look at Steve Diggs, and look at Sophie Ho, and Reed Bohm, and all the people who are involved with this. So yes, and one of the hopes that we have with this is that you can jump in and out as you have time, and you can kind of, it's like, yes, this is a kind of a matchmaking. It's like, oh, hey, this data hero has those skills, but that data hero can say, I can't do it right now. So credit. Thank you.
So for the data hero that's in the trenches and doing all the rescue activities, are they doing it based on where you've matched the data to go? So based on their requirements, or do you have some sort of set of standards that you apply before sending it off to that repository?
I'll start to answer that as Ruth gets up. You seem to think we're much further along in this process than we actually are. I love that, but we are not necessarily playing matchmaker for where your data goes. We are playing matchmaker with somebody who can help you with your data. So we're not necessarily telling, maybe there is something called the repository finder tool that maybe we'll be able to link into this to help with that aspect of it. But, you know, as a hero self-identifies, they can probably say, oh yeah, no, I work with this kind of data, or I work at this type of facility. And so that might be part of this matchmaking equation. But it's not necessarily, oh, the data is going to go here, so we're going to find somebody who works there to help you with it. Does that make sense?
Was that you're actually trying to find a repository that would be willing to take this data? And then my question was, if you find one, then is the hero helping with the requirements for that data repository?
Yes. But I note that's not the only use case. Let's go back to my NSSDC use case, the 600 data sets from way back when. They want this done because they want to update the metadata in their catalog, and they want to have data in their modern data formats that their data users really use. And they're quite willing to talk to data heroes. In fact, they have done so, to say, yeah, here's some tools to help you get started, and they want the data back. So they're both the submitter and kind of the approver of all of that, because it's not going to go back into their catalog in a new format until they think it's good enough. And that's totally fair. So that's one model where, it's going to go back right where it came from, because that's the right agency already and they want it. But there's other models that are different than that. Here's my box of research, I'm retiring, but all this data is very useful and should be shared with lots of people now that I'm done with it. And it needs homes, in which case you'll go through the box and go, yeah, that goes to AIDA, maybe not anymore, and BICO-DEMO, and NSIDC. And because this one's polar and these two aren't, this one's ocean, right? And so, yeah, there are many different routes and different kinds of data activities that can happen here, because it depends on what the needs are. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who think it's a one size fits all, and I'm not one of them. I think that probably every single request will be different and will require different things to be successful.
For example, just from what she said, I came up with 3 different use cases just from what she was saying, and you can probably come up with like 40. Kind of
40,000.
I'm sure. So kind of the updating of metadata to a more modern, or to the current standard, or to the filing cabinet full of stuff. Or the data, or data that doesn't currently have an identified element. So that's just like 3 of the many that we've gathered around. And this is trying to make the matches to help address all of the possible use cases. And we're not always going to have the right heroes around to do the work. And so that's going to be a big old caveat here, that it is all volunteer. So if we don't happen to have some of the skills, we'll try to find them, but there's no promise.
I think I skipped the introduce myself. I'm Alexis Gerritsen. I'm a ESIP community fellow. I'm also addicted to iNaturalist, which is like IDing photos that people submit. And part of what makes it easy for me is sometimes I can click the this is a plant, not an animal button, and sometimes I can click this is an ichneumoniid wasp, or like sometimes the species level. So it seems like one way to do this would be to present the data advocate with, here's a data set that's been submitted. Does it need OCR? Yes, no. Does it need this thing? Yes, no. Does it need this thing? Yes, no. Tagging it with the things that might be helpful. Or the data advocate could be the person saying, I will email this community on your behalf. I'll send your data to this person. I'll figure out how to make that happen. And though those seem like very different ways of doing the data advocate role, like is it I can log on for an hour and say these 15 ones need this type of rescue. Or it could be something very, very more involved with lots of maybe hand holding.
Yeah, and just tagging into that, that's something that's kind of been done with OpenStreetMap, where there are like levels of people that submit. And so you have like your advocate ones that are the ones that can just do yes, no type questions. And then there are the ones that are like advocate twos, and they're the people that can maybe answer some of the more complicated, like the species question, but not real like that equivalent. And then you have like you guys that are kind of at the top level of that might be able to answer or do some of that more behind the scenes, like actually connecting the actual human beings. That might, maybe there should be levels of advocacy. Intern level, you mean?
Oh, no, you start off as a minion and eventually you become a. Oh, okay. Anyways, I love the levels of advocacy or whatever we're calling it. Because, right. No. Mm-mm. But I'm not sure about I mean, you can have heroes that have been really good and rescued a lot of things, but that's not the same as levels. Right. Right, you know.
Really broadly can address a lot of this, and then there are some who are like, I can do OCR and that's my thing, and if OCR, send it to me.
Right.
Can I have comments? Right. Actually, I love this advocate because, of course, I think this program start probably passively. Because we need to, because people come to you, okay, they want to rescue data. There's some data to rescue. So you can't start doing that. But at the same time, when you build this kind of program, that's very proactive. Right? You can just also kind of, well, when some people try to rescue distinct animals, then the world, other people start looking at, oh yeah, we need to do more on this. So I think that's first thing. And also one more comment is that, so it seems to me, okay, those people who ask for data rescue can end up also be actually, like you just said, NOAA or even NASA itself, but they don't have this kind of expertise at this time. But actually, well, they'll be willing to, they have a capability to be the top repository. So end up, when you, the matchmaker, do something for me, I can just bring the data back to the depository.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, it's really up to the submitter what the end state is. I want to get rid of it. I want it back in a better state.
Got a question. So the matchmaking doesn't have to be one-to-one, right?
No.
So a problem could be multiple pieces, then can be each individually matched with an advocate. Okay.
The other thing that maybe the submitter, one of you said something about how one of the people, or maybe it was the NASA case project where they offered some skill or they pointed to areas where they could learn about how to do something. So maybe that's something you could ask submitters to do. Like if they know that this is going to take a specific skill, they could submit a link to wherever that like GitHub explains how to do that or something like that. They just have a box where it's like, put anything you know in this box so we can help.
And this isn't necessarily about the skill set. It's more of a policy kind of question. So I could imagine a case where someone says, well, I've got this pile of stuff. I want it become digitized basically for me. And so really the policy is whether everything that goes through becomes public domain of some sort.
And tagging on to that, if there would be, yeah, fair and then also like prioritized based on maybe levels of like high importance because it's going to,
Yeah.
it's big and it's going to everyone or something like that.
Right. And I've got to admit that if you're trying to make your data public, that's great. And if you are making it more complicated than that, the odds of it happening are kind of lower, I think, just naturally. And I think that needs to be just said right up front. But there's also the flip side of it. You know, it has to be ethically fair. So if you hand me a bunch of like social science data with people's addresses in the state of Alaska, you know, where people are, you know, a mile apart, and, you know, that's a problem. And so, yes. So I guess actually you have to, that's a skill. You have to understand that there are privacy, endangered species, and other kinds of ethical issues that need to be considered on some of these things. Now, if it's just a, you know,
Is that, so that would be like city training, like IRB? Training.
it could be IRB if it's really social science data, but, you know, dens of endangered species is not a IRB issue. So you have to know that complex.
Yeah, and it's not just a social science issue, of course. Like this is also a biological community data
Exactly.
thing, or a personal data, health data thing.
Yep.
So
You
think
got
about
it.
like HIPAA is something else that
Yep.
would fit in there.
Yep. That's why fair is not good enough. It has to be ethically fair, and probably a few other things too.
And also probably like military, like my department has a whole bunch of military records sitting in our basement, but we probably could not hand those over to get like
And I would be
digitized.
happy if you didn't.
Yeah. It would, yeah, have to be aware, like the advocate would have to be aware of all those.
I know capture that here. I also kind of captured that. So I started writing down some of these other things that are kind of bubbling up as we're talking. Yeah, and so kind of the policy concern about making things ethically fair or as fair or fair aligned is something that I like to say because nothing is ever truly fair. And fair data is inherently unfair in a lot of ways. Completely different discussion, but yes, you know, it's like we need to think about data ethics and that sort of thing as well. You know, we got that one. Yes.
We have somebody who's getting your degree in it.
In geoscience policy, yes, because I have apparently too much free time amongst all these other things. We do have a new person hanging out in the back. Steve Diggs has actually been involved with this data at risk project at least since day one. You know, so Steve, I'll catch you up. So we're trying to better define this data advocate based on what sorts of skills they may need. And it may not be an all-encompassing skill set, as well as some of the particular roles that they might actually play. And along the way, we've come up with all sorts of other questions and comments. But I don't know if you can read these from all the way in the very back, because you can't hang out in the back if I'm here, right? You know, we've been calling this kind of the matchmaker service, and I know that there are some people who are a little bit uncomfortable with that terminology. But really, we have found that is really the best way to describe this. We still have like 20 minutes, so let's keep kind of rolling. Who's next? Sorry, I'll let you run since I'm writing.
No, since we have 20 minutes, I'm just curious. So how many use cases you have been rescued so far? Do you any idea? And how many in demand and how many actually you resolve?
Okay, so dataAtRisk.org only has step 1 implemented of that process. Okay? Boulder Data Rescue has a different answer. They've done a lot. my class, many of the students I had realized quickly that they didn't have the skills they needed to do any of this, even though I had them pick data sets that I graded the data by ease and skill set. And many of them learned that they didn't have the skills they thought they did. So there were, like I said, several NASA data sets that were rescued that actually NASA has now in the NSSDC data catalog as being rescued by these people. And, you know, so they got credit for it, which, by the way, I think is a really good thing for heroes to get, is credit, mention on posters in places and, you know, that sort of stuff. And we've had a number of other kinds of data that have gone through those processes and have, if not gotten all the way to the final step, made it quite a, you know, way forward. I was basically dealing with 15 students a semester, and I would say all of them made considerable progress. 20% totally blew it out of the water and did great. But, you know, it's, you know, I was asking them to basically be able to do the whole gamut of things. We're not going to ask these heroes to do the whole gamut of things. We're going to ask them to do one or two different kinds of things, whatever's within their skill set or that they want to learn. I mean, we're not going to ask somebody who knows how to OCR and test that very well to write some bit fiddling script to take files and convert bits. That's just not going to happen.
When those people have done this successfully, right, they always show their skills. They always show their roles. So perhaps you may go back to them or to do some analysis, then probably can put in there as well. That's my point. Because now we just can't imagine, because we are not even putting that, we try to wear that shoes. But those people actually
Yeah,
they
so
already
it's
done that.
it's
right.
a QA step you're talking about, QAing the quality of our contributors.
Exactly.
And yes, I agree,
And
that's
those- and also-
totally necessary, yes.
Yeah, also kind of you have to doing some kind of metrics performance.
Yep.
Right? You kind
Yep.
of look at hey how they perform.
Yep.
That's definitely a qualification involving there.
Yep.
Right?
And
also
there's actually been a fair amount of work
sure.
on what are the best ways to do that in kind of volunteer crowdsource
Exactly.
type activities.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
also
yeah.
for all the volunteers, they must full of patience. So that's also one of the
Right. Well, she was earlier where there was a suggestion of levels, but I don't know that it's levels, because just because you're really good at OCR doesn't mean you're a level 1. You might be a level 3 OCR and a level 0 scripter. Okay, good. I don't think it is the right term, but
It's a way to capture.
yeah.
Yeah, this seems to fit into the unhelpful, scary box of like, how do you credit lots and lots of maybe very minimal contributions that all the citizen science projects face, is like, you know, I clicked, is it a plan? Do I get credit in the final manuscript? But one of the other things that seems like we seem to be focusing on advocate number 1, like Blue Cat 1 and less Blue Cat 2, which seems like a different skill set to be able to say all of the things that need to be done have been done. Yeah, like the QA seems like it might require some of those technical skills that we had sort of stuck in a different box. Like knowing that all the things have been done and done well seems like a very different skill than connecting people to other people. So I'm not sure exactly how those fit together or would look like. I don't know.
Well, it could be maybe your level 3 advocates are the ones who do that last step, and levels 1s and 2s do the first couple or something like that.
And also maybe they could have, I don't know if it's up there, knowledge of,
Here, I'm from.
oh no, it is.
Right too. I was just trying to say.
I know, but I'm just trying to save my knee.
Yeah, I know that. I was trying to do that too.
You forgot the metrics.
Oh, I put metrics over there.
Oh, where?
Because the metrics aren't necessarily, okay, so I actually have 3 sets of things that I'm tracking here. Metrics of performance does not really fit under the advocate. So I put that over here. So I did get metrics. It just, you can't see it because I ran out of wall space. Right, so the metrics is not necessarily in the advocate role, it's not necessarily in the hero role, it's not necessarily in the submitter role, but it needs to be kind of throughout. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, but thank you for, I'm sorry, I ran out of wall space. Because I also write big when I'm doing these. We have 12 minutes, but what else do we need? Do you feel like needs to be said right now? I would also like to invite you, what is the Google group name?
Hold on.
Okay, Ruth is going to look that up. I would encourage you, if you are interested in this whole thing and in helping move it forward, because right now it is more conceptual than actual, and we'd love to move this more towards actual. Join our Google group email list, and we have a call. We're taking July off because Ruth deserves a vacation and she's taking one. And so we decided that she definitely deserves it. But I would encourage you to join that Google group, and you can participate in the calls when you have time, and when you don't, that's fine, because that's exactly what we envision with the data-at-risk.org is when you have time, you can participate. When you don't, there's not necessarily, and the last one is over, there's another one over there. I just couldn't write when it was over there. But if anyone else has any final thoughts? Cloudburst is the company that is currently supporting our website. Joan Sias. Did they, for free? Yeah. But like I said, like we said, really only kind of the very first part of this whole process is really encoded into the website right now. So. It's pretty easy. It's data_nomination_tool at googlegroups.com. So you can sign up and we'll approve you. I don't even know if we need to approve people to join it, but you should be able to find it.
What it'll do is give you a monthly email saying, hey, remember our next one is here. And well, actually, you've been holding some of them.
Yeah. Like I said, we're taking July off because we had a lot of deadlines or a lot of things that we were trying to get to accomplish in a fairly short time. But we would be happy to expand that group that we currently have active, because there's been a lot of really good feedback and really good ideas here.
I mean, we're trying to make this a community effort. So enough community participation that whatever we come up with needs at least a minimum level everybody needs. So we have a lot of use cases so far.
Right, and eventually, the extraordinarily long-term goal of this is that this is not going to be limited to Earth and space science data, but this would be a tool that you might be able to expand to life science, medical, the gamut. But because it started by a bunch of Earth and space scientists, we're going to start with what we know. So, because that's a question that we've gotten when we've talked about this. Oh, is this going to be? I was like, we're starting with what we know that we have a better understanding of. So. So I think, yeah, I think if you go to Google Groups and then you can search for data nomination tool, and okay, email. So Ruth is going to write her email address down, and she will add you. But yeah, we'll look into that. And so one thing that I forgot to mention, and Ruth forgot to mention at the start of the session, is that there is that fabulous document of 3 takeaways from each session that is kind of this rolling document for the ESIP meeting. I would love it if some of you in this room would go into that document and put in what your takeaway from this session is, because I can put what I think the takeaway is, but I ran the session, so I know what I wanted to get. I'd really like to see what you all got out of it. So please do that. I can't remember what the bit.ly link is, but you can find it on Sketch.
Here, I'm putting it.
Yes, summer meeting SM19 takeaways. So I appreciate you. Thank you for being here.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for attending.
And thank you for indulging me with my markers and paper. I find this a lot better for discussions than trying to do a PowerPoint or something like that. So y'all are heroes for being in here with us. So thank you.